Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into something darker than your middle school yearbook photo. Not the fun sock hop kind. Not the milkshake at the diner kind. I mean the real, actual rules, rigid, exhausting, and designed to turn little girls into miniature adult women before they'd even hit puberty. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. A huge thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. Your idea shaped tonight's journey, and I'm genuinely grateful. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Somehow, it's always 2 a.m. somewhere. And speaking of the channel, we're now live on Spotify. You can find the link in the description if you want to listen there. Now, dim those lights, switch on a fan for that soft white noise, get comfortable, and maybe tuck your feet in so the imaginary, judgmental aunts can't critique your posture. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to be a 10-year-old girl in 1952? Did they really wear gloves to go grocery shopping? What happened if you laughed too loud at a school assembly? Could you wear pants, or was that basically treason? Were you allowed to have opinions, or did those come with a marriage license? Would you last a day following rules that controlled everything from how you sat to what you dreamed about? And now, congratulations, you've just woken up as a young girl in 1950 America. You have a curfew, a crinoline that itches, and approximately zero control over your future. Good luck. You didn't just wake up in the 1950s, you woke up with a mission. Prove you're responsible, obedient, and well-trained. Before breakfast, before brushing your teeth, before anything resembling childhood joy, you had to make your bed. But not just make it perfectly. Hospital corners, no wrinkles, pillows fluffed like you were expecting the Queen of England to inspect them. Your mother would run her hand across the bedspread, and if she felt even a ripple, you'd be doing it again. This wasn't about hygiene, it was about discipline. Because in the 1950s, even your mattress had standards. Let's talk about what perfectly actually meant. First, you strip back the covers, carefully, because yanking them would wrinkle the fitted sheet underneath. Then you smooth the bottom sheet with your hands, running them across every inch like you were diffusing a bomb made of cotton. Any bumps? Start over. Next came the top sheet, pulled tight and tucked under the mattress at the foot of the bed with military precision. This is where hospital corners came in. Those crisp triangular folds that require the geometry skills of an architect and the patience of a saint. You folded, tucked, smoothed, and repeated on both sides until the sheet looked like it had been ironed in place. Then the blanket. Same process. Pull, tuck, fold, smooth. No sagging edges, no loose corners. If your blanket dipped even slightly, your mother would notice, and she always noticed. On top of that came the bedspread, usually something heavy, quilted, and impossible to manage with 10-year-old arms. You wrestled it into place, smoothed it flat, and made sure the pattern aligned perfectly on both sides. Symmetry mattered. If one side hung lower than the other, you'd hear about it. Pillows were the final test. They had to be fluffed, not just patted, but genuinely fluffed until they looked soft, inviting, and utterly untouched. Then you placed them at the head of the bed, perfectly centered, edges aligned. Some mothers required decorative pillows on top of those. Yes, decorative pillows, for a child's bed, that no one would see except family. And here's the kicker. You did this every single morning, no exceptions. Sick? Make your bed. Running late? For school? Make your bed. Exhausted from helping with dinner until 9 p.m. the night before? Make your bed. It was drilled into you that a messy bed meant a messy mind, a lazy spirit, and a future of disappointment. If you can't even make your bed, your mother would say, hands on hips, how will you ever keep a house for a husband? Ah, yes, the husband. Even at age 8, your bed-making skills were being evaluated as practice for your inevitable role as a housewife. This wasn't about teaching responsibility or tidiness for your own benefit. It was about training you to meet someone else's standards. Your bed wasn't yours. It was a reflection of your family, your upbringing, and your potential as a future wife. No pressure. And if you failed the inspection, you'd be called back upstairs to do it again, sometimes 2 or 3 times. You'd miss breakfast. You'd be late for school. But the lesson was more important than food or punctuality. The lesson was, perfection is expected and anything less is unacceptable. So you learned. You learned to smooth, tuck, fold and fluff like your life depended on it. Because in a way it did. Rolling out of bed in pyjamas and shuffling to the kitchen. Not in this decade. Young girls were expected to dress properly for every meal, even breakfast at 7 a.m. That meant a clean dress, possibly with a bow, your hair brushed and styled, and shoes, yes, shoes, on your feet. No bare legs unless you were under 5, no messy hair unless you wanted to lecture about looking like you'd been raised by wolves. Even at home, even alone, you were supposed to look like you were ready for a surprise visit from the pastor's wife. Because apparently, God and your neighbours were always watching. Let's start with the dress. Not just any dress, a clean, pressed, appropriate dress. If you spilled juice on it yesterday, it went in the laundry. If it had a stain, it stayed in the closet. You wore something fresh, something that signalled you cared about your appearance, even if you were just eating toast in your own kitchen. The dress had to fit properly, not too tight, not too loose, hemline at the knee or just below. Anything shorter, and you'd be told you looked improper. Anything longer, and you'd trip over it, which would also be improper because ladies don't stumble. Then came your hair. Bedhead was not an option. You had to brush it until it shone, then style it into something acceptable. Braids, a ponytail, pinned back with barrettes. Or if your mother was feeling ambitious, pin curls from the night before that you'd slept on like a lumpy torture device. If you had bangs, they had to be perfectly trimmed and brushed to the side. If you had long hair, it had to be tied back neatly. Loose, wild, uncombed hair was a sign of neglect, and neglect reflected poorly on your mother. So even if you were tired, even if you just wanted 5 more minutes of sleep, you stood in front of the mirror and made yourself presentable. Shoes were non-negotiable, even indoors, even if you were just padding around the house. You wore clean socks or tights, no holes, no slouching, and your everyday shoes polished and tied properly. Mary Janes were popular, those shiny black or brown shoes with the strap across the top. They pinched, they slipped, and they made your feet sweat, but they looked appropriate. And looking appropriate was more important than comfort. Going barefoot was for toddlers and summer afternoons in the backyard. Inside the house, in front of your family at the breakfast table, shoes. Always. Why? Because you never knew who might stop by. The neighbour could knock on the door. A relative could drop in unannounced. The milkman might need to speak with your mother. And if anyone saw you in your pyjamas, with messy hair and bare feet, they'd think your family had no standards. They'd whisper about it at church. They'd judge your mother for raising a sloppy child. And in the 1950s, judgment was currency. Reputations were built or destroyed on the smallest details, so you dressed. Every morning, even on Saturdays, even during summer vacation, you dressed like you were about to receive company, because in a sense you always were. You were always on display, always being evaluated, always representing your family. There was no casual. There was no just staying home. There was only presentable or embarrassing, and embarrassing was not an option. It sounds exhausting because it was. Little girls weren't allowed to just be comfortable. Comfort was laziness. Comfort was letting yourself go. Comfort meant you didn't care, and not caring was the worst sin of all. So you learned to care. You learned to put on the dress, tie the shoes, brush the hair, and show up to breakfast looking like a miniature adult. Because childhood in the 1950s wasn't about being a child. It was about practicing to be the perfect woman you'd be forced to become. Children in the 1950s operated under one golden rule: be seen, not heard. If adults were talking, you sat silently with your hands folded in your lap, eyes forward, mouth shut. You didn't interrupt. You didn't ask questions. You didn't offer your thoughts on politics, the weather, or whether Aunt Mildred's casserole tasted like cardboard. If an adult addressed you directly, you answered politely, briefly, and with a yes, ma'am, or no, sir. Anything else was considered rude, disrespectful, and grounds for punishment. Your opinions? They didn't exist yet. You'd get those when you turned 18. Maybe. Let's paint the picture. You're sitting in the living room. Your parents are entertaining guests, neighbours, church friends, your mother's book club. You've been told to sit quietly on the sofa, legs crossed at the ankles, hands folded, posture perfect. The adults are talking about grown-up things, mortgage rates, the new highway being built, Betty's son who just got back from Korea. You're bored. You're so bored you could scream. But you don't. You sit. You listen. You stay silent. Then someone says something wrong. Factually, objectively wrong. Maybe they mispronounce a word. Maybe they get a date mixed up. Maybe they say Paris is the capital of Spain. You know the right answer. It's on the tip of your tongue. You want to help, to contribute, to show that you're smart and paying attention. But you don't. Because interrupting an adult, even to correct them, even politely, is unforgivable. You'd be scolded immediately. Excuse me, young lady. Did someone ask for your opinion? The room would go silent, all eyes on you. Your mother's face would flush with embarrassment. You'd be sent to your room, and later you'd get a lecture about respect, humility, and knowing your place. So you learn to swallow your words. You learn to bite your tongue until it hurt. You learn that your thoughts, your knowledge, your perspective, none of it mattered in the presence of adults. They were the authorities. You were the student, and students didn't speak unless called upon. Even at the dinner table, the rule applied. If your father and mother were discussing something, you stayed silent. You ate quietly, chewed with your mouth closed, and waited. If they wanted your input, they'd ask, "And what did you learn at school today?" That was your cue. You'd answer briefly, "We learned about the Pilgrims, sir," and then stop. No elaborating unless prompted. No sharing funny stories unless invited. No complaining, questioning, or offering unsolicited commentary. Dinner conversation was adult conversation. You were just there to eat and observe. And here's the cruelest part. This rule didn't just apply to strangers or formal occasions. It applied at home, with your own family, in your own house. Your voice was considered an intrusion. Your words were seen as unnecessary noise. Even if you had something important to say, even if you were hurt, scared, or confused, you waited. You waited for permission to speak. And sometimes that permission never came. It taught you that your thoughts weren't valuable, that your perspective didn't matter, that the world didn't need to hear from you. You learned to shrink, to minimize, to become invisible. Because in the 1950s, good girls weren't heard. They were quiet, obedient, and grateful for the rare moments when someone actually asked them a question. And even then, they kept their answers short. Because taking up space, even with your voice, was unladylike. Slouching was not just bad manners, it was a moral failing. Young girls were taught to sit up straight, shoulders back, chin level, feet together and flat on the floor. No crossing your legs like a hooligan. No leaning, no sprawling. You sat like you had a book balanced on your head, which, by the way, some etiquette classes actually made you do. Walking was equally controlled. Graceful, measured steps. No stomping, no running indoors, and definitely no hands in your pockets. Your body was not your own. It It was a public display of your family's values, and if you forgot, someone would remind you. Loudly. Posture wasn't just about looking proper. It was about signalling discipline, self-control, and femininity. A girl who slouched was lazy, careless, unrefined. She'd grow into a woman who let herself go, who didn't care about appearances, who embarrassed her husband at dinner parties. So from the moment you could sit upright, you were trained. Shoulders back, chin up, don't hunch. The corrections were constant, relentless, exhausting. At school you sat in hard wooden chairs for hours, spine straight, feet flat. If you slouched, the teacher noticed. If you leaned on your desk, you'd be reprimanded. Young ladies sit up straight. You'd snap to attention, pull your shoulders back, and feel the ache settle into your lower back. But you didn't complain. Complaining was weakness, so you sat perfectly still, perfectly straight until your muscles screamed. At home, it was worse. Your mother watched you like a hawk. If you curled up on the couch with a book, she'd tell you to sit properly. If you sprawled on the floor to play jacks, she'd remind you that ladies don't lie around like that. Even when you were tired, even when you were alone, you were expected to maintain perfect posture. Because posture wasn't just physical, it was moral. It showed the world you had been raised correctly. And then there were the etiquette classes. Some families sent their daughters to charm school or deportment lessons, where girls practiced walking with books on their heads. Yes, actual books. You'd balance a hardcover on your crown and walk across the room, slowly, gracefully, without letting it fall. If it dropped, you started over. The goal was to train your body to move with controlled elegance. No bouncing, no swaying, no hurried steps. Just smooth, measured, feminine movement. Crossing your legs was a minefield. If you crossed them at the knee, you looked too casual. If you crossed them at the ankle, that was acceptable, but only if your knees stayed together and your skirt didn't ride up. The safest option was to sit with your feet flat on the floor, knees together, hands folded in your lap. This was called the lady's pose, and it was drilled into you until it became automatic, even when it was uncomfortable, even when your legs fell asleep. Walking had rules too. You didn't stomp, you didn't shuffle, you didn't swing your arms too much or take steps that were too long. You walked heel to toe, smoothly, gracefully, like you were gliding across the floor, and you never, ever ran indoors. Running was for boys and emergencies. Girls walked, always. Your body wasn't yours. It was a statement. Every movement, every position, every gesture was being judged, evaluated, and critiqued. And the message was clear. Control yourself. Discipline your body. Perform femininity at all times, because a girl who couldn't sit up straight would grow into a woman who couldn't keep her husband interested. And that, more than anything, was the ultimate failure. Girls were expected to be pleasant, cheerful, and agreeable at all times. But there was a catch. You couldn't be too happy. Smiling too big made you look unladylike. Laughing too loud made you seem unrefined. Giggling at the wrong moment. Scandalous. You were supposed to radiate a gentle, controlled warmth, like a light bulb set to the dimmest setting. Anything more and you risked being called hysterical or unserious. So you learned to smile just enough to seem polite, but not so much that anyone thought you actually had feelings. Let's start with the smile itself. It had to be soft, close-mouthed, and demure. No showing all your teeth like some kind of grinning maniac. No laughing so hard your eyes crinkled or your face turned red. If you did, someone would say, "My goodness, calm down. You're making a spectacle of yourself," and spectacles were bad. Very bad. The ideal 1950s girl smile was subtle, controlled, and just slightly mysterious. You smiled when greeted. You smiled when complimented. You smiled when your mother introduced you to guests. But you didn't smile too much, or people would think you were simple-minded. You didn't smile too little, or they'd think you were sullen. You walked a tightrope between pleasant and pathetic, warm and unhinged. Laughing was even more regulated. If something was funny, you could laugh, but quietly. A soft chuckle, a gentle giggle behind your hand, maybe a light "oh my" if you were feeling bold, but loud laughter, the kind that came from your belly, the kind that made you double over and gasp for air. Absolutely not. That was for boys, for clowns, for people with no self-respect. Girls who laughed too loud were called hysterical, a word that literally means out of control due to your uterus. Fun times. If you giggled at the wrong moment, say during a church service or while a teacher was talking, you'd be punished. Swiftly. You'd be pulled aside, lectured about self-control and reminded that young ladies don't behave like silly children, even if what happened was genuinely funny, even if everyone else was trying not to laugh too. You were held to a higher standard. Because girls weren't just expected to control their bodies, they were expected to control their emotions too. And here's where it gets even darker. Smiling wasn't optional. If you didn't smile, if your face rested in anything other than pleasant neutrality, you'd be told to cheer up or stop looking so gloomy. If you were upset, you had to hide it. If you were angry, you had to bury it. If you were tired, you had to plaster on a smile and pretend everything was fine. Because girls who didn't smile were difficult, unfriendly, ungrateful. So you learned to perform happiness. You learned to smile on command, to laugh politely at jokes that weren't funny, to act delighted by things that bored you to tears. You became an expert at emotional theatre. And the scary part, you got so good at it that sometimes you forgot what genuine joy actually felt like. The performance became the reality. Your face wasn't yours, it was public property. Adults felt entitled to comment on it, to demand that you change it, to police your expressions. Smile, sweetie. Don't look so serious. Why the long face? As if you owed the world a cheerful expression at all times, as if your emotions were an inconvenience that needed to be managed. And the irony? Boys could be grumpy, serious or stoic, and it was fine. It made them look thoughtful, intense, masculine. But if you weren't smiling, you were a problem, you were rude, you were setting a bad example. So you smiled. You smiled until your cheeks hurt. You smiled through exhaustion, frustration, and sadness. You smiled because not smiling wasn't an option. Dinner wasn't just a meal, it was a performance. You sat up straight, napkin in your lap, elbows off the table, chewing, quietly with your mouth closed. You cut your food into small ladylike bites. You didn't reach across the table. You asked politely for items to be passed. You didn't speak with food in your mouth. You didn't complain about what was served, even if it was liver and onions for the third time this week. And you certainly didn't leave the table until everyone was finished and your mother gave permission. One wrong move and you'd be sent to your room, hungry and humiliated. Let's talk about the napkin first. Before you even touched your fork, you had to unfold your napkin and place it neatly in your lap. Not on the table, not tucked into your collar like some kind of toddler. In your lap. If you forgot, your mother would clear her throat and stare at you until you figured it out. The napkin stayed there for the entire meal, and you used it to dab, never wipe, your mouth between bites. When dinner was over, you folded it loosely and placed it to the left of your plate. Precision mattered. Next came your posture. Sit up straight, shoulders back, feet flat on the floor or crossed at the ankles, elbows off the table. Always. Elbows off the table was repeated so many times it became a mantra, a battle cry, a religious commandment. If your elbow so much as grazed the table's edge, someone would notice. Your father might tap the table, your grandmother might tusk. Your mother might say, "We're not at a barn, dear," and you'd yank your elbows back, humiliated. Eating itself was a choreographed dance. You picked up your fork with your right hand, your knife with your left, or was it the other way around? It depended on whether you were cutting or not. American style, European style, the rules shifted depending on who was teaching you, and getting it wrong meant looking ignorant. You cut your food into small, delicate bites, never shoving a huge piece of meat in your mouth like some kind of caveman. You chewed slowly, quietly, with your mouth closed. If you made noise while chewing, you'd be glared at. If you chewed with your mouth open, you'd be sent away from the table entirely. You never reached across the table. Ever. Even if the salt shaker was 6 inches away from your fingertips. You said, "Please pass the salt," and waited for someone to hand it to you. If no one heard you, you asked again, louder this time, but still polite. You didn't grab, you didn't lunge, you waited. Patience was part of the lesson. So was understanding that your needs weren't urgent enough to justify breaking protocol. And the food itself? You ate what was served. No complaints, no wrinkling your nose, no pushing things around your plate to make it look like you tried. If your mother served liver, Brussels sprouts, or some kind of gelatinous casserole that looked like it had been scraped off the bottom of a lake, you smiled, said, "Thank you," and ate it. Because wasting food was a sin, and complaining about food was disrespectful. You ate every bite, even if it made you gag. Conversation at dinner was also regulated. You didn't speak unless spoken to. You didn't interrupt. You didn't dominate the conversation. If an adult asked you a question, you answered politely and briefly, then returned to silence. If your siblings were talking, you listened. If your father was speaking, everyone listened. Dinner was his stage, and you were the audience. And leaving the table, forget it. You didn't just stand up and walk away when you were done. You sat there, quietly, hands in your lap waiting for everyone else to finish, even if you were done 10 minutes early, even if you were bored out of your mind. You waited until your mother said, "You may be excused." And then, and only then, you stood, pushed your chair in carefully and left the room without running. Table manners weren't just about eating. They were about obedience, patience, and knowing your place. And your place was silent, polite, and hungry for approval. By age 8, you were expected to be a junior housewife in training. That meant helping with dishes, dusting, sweeping, folding laundry, and setting the table without being told. If your mother was cooking, you appeared in the kitchen like a helpful ghost, ready to stir, peel, or wash. If she was cleaning, you grabbed a rag. If she looked even slightly tired, you offered to help. This wasn't optional. It was your duty as a daughter. And if you didn't do it cheerfully, well, you'd hear about it. From your mother, your grandmother, and possibly the lady at church who somehow always knew everything. Let's be clear. This wasn't about teaching responsibility or life skills for your own benefit. It was about preparing you for your inevitable future as a housewife and mother. You weren't learning to take care of yourself. You were learning to take care of other people. Constantly, without complaint, without praise. Because that's what women did. Your day started with chores. Before school, you helped make breakfast. Maybe you set the table, poured juice, or buttered toast. After school, you came home to more chores. You changed out of your school dress, put on your around-the-house dress, yes, a different dress, and got to work. Dishes were a daily battle, no dishwasher, just a sink full of soapy water, a scrub brush, and hands that would be red and raw by the time you were done. You washed, rinsed, dried, and put everything away. Every single day. Then came the sweeping. Floors didn't clean themselves, and your mother expected them spotless. You swept the kitchen, the hallway, the living room. If there was dirt, you'd hear about it. If you missed a corner, you'd be sent back to do it again. If you sighed or rolled your eyes, you'd get a lecture about gratitude and hard work. When I was your age, your mother would say, "I was doing twice as much. You don't know how easy you have it." Laundry was another never-ending task. You helped hang clothes on the line, brought them in when they were dry, folded everything neatly and put it away. Folding wasn't casual, it was precise. Towels had to be folded in thirds, sheets had to be folded flat. If your folds were sloppy, you'd redo them, because sloppy laundry meant you'd be a sloppy wife. And then there was cooking. You weren't just watching your mother cook, you were actively helping, peeling potatoes, shelling peas, stirring pots, setting timers, learning recipes by heart because someday you'd need to make them for your own family. You weren't encouraged to experiment or get creative. You were taught to follow instructions, to replicate what had been done before, to make food that was edible and efficient. Cooking was a skill, yes, but it was also a duty. And duties weren't supposed to be fun. The worst part. You were expected to do all of this without being asked. If you waited for your mother to tell you to help, you'd be scolded for being lazy. You see me working, don't you? You see the dishes piling up. Why am I the only one doing anything around here? So you learned to anticipate, to read the room, to jump in before she had to ask. Because asking meant she was disappointed, and disappointing your mother was the ultimate failure, and heaven help you if you complained. If you said you were tired, you'd be reminded that your mother was tired too. If you said you had homework, you'd be told that school could wait but dinner couldn't. If you said it wasn't fair that your brother didn't have to help, you'd be told that boys have different responsibilities, which was code for boys don't do housework, and you need to accept that. So you helped. You helped until your back ached and your fingers pruned. You helped because not helping meant you were ungrateful, lazy, and destined to be a bad wife. You helped because this was your training, your purpose, your future. And in the 1950s, a girl's future was written in dish soap and dustpans. Children in the 1950s didn't just play. They engaged in structured, approved activities that reinforced gender roles and social expectations. For girls, that meant dolls, tea sets, jump rope, jacks, or playing house. You didn't wrestle, you didn't climb trees, you didn't get dirty or loud or wild. If you wanted to read, it had to be appropriate books, nothing too exciting, nothing too sad, and definitely nothing that questioned authority. Your imagination was yours, but only within very narrow lanes. Step outside them, and you'd be reminded that young ladies don't act like that. Let's start with dolls. Dolls weren't just toys, they were training tools. Baby dolls taught you how to hold, feed, and care for an infant. Fashion dolls taught you about clothes, grooming, and presentation. You were expected to play with your dolls gently, quietly, and maternally. You rocked them. You changed their tiny outfits. You pretended to put them to bed. You were rehearsing motherhood, whether you wanted to or not. Tea sets were another approved activity. You'd set up a tiny table, arrange your dolls or stuffed animals as guests, and pour imaginary tea from a miniature porcelain pot. You'd practice serving, conversing politely, and hosting, all skills you'd need as a wife entertaining your husband's colleagues. It was adorable, sure. It was also indoctrination. Jump rope was acceptable because it was quiet, feminine, and didn't involve physical aggression. You could jump alone or with friends, chanting rhymes as the rope turned. But you didn't jump too high, too wild, or too competitively. If you tripped and fell, scraping your knee and crying, you'd be told to get up, brush yourself off, and be more careful. No one coddled you. You were expected to be tough, but not too tough. Jacks was another safe option. You sat on the ground, bounced a ball, and scooped up small metal jacks in increasingly difficult combinations. It required focus, dexterity, and patience. It was quiet. It kept you seated. It didn't make you sweat. Perfect. Playing house was perhaps the most important game of all. You pretended to be a wife and mother, cooking invisible meals, cleaning invisible messes, and caring for invisible children. Your friends played along, taking turns being the mother, the children, or sometimes the father, though that role was boring because fathers just went to work and came home. The game was always the same. The mother did everything, and everyone else just existed around her. Sound familiar? But what about the things you actually wanted to do? Climb trees? Absolutely not. That was for boys. You'd ruin your dress, scrape your knees and look like a wild animal. Playing in the dirt? Same problem. Building forts? Too rough. Playing cowboys and Indians? That was boy territory. Running, wrestling, tackling, shouting, all forbidden. You were supposed to be gentle, careful, and calm. Always. If you gravitated toward boy activities, you'd be called a tomboy. And while that might sound cute now, back then it was a warning label. It meant you weren't developing properly, weren't embracing femininity, weren't preparing to be a wife. Your parents would worry. They'd redirect you. They'd buy you more dolls, more tea sets, more dresses. They'd gently but firmly guide you back into the lane-marked girl. Even reading was monitored. You could read books, but only certain ones. Nancy Drew was acceptable. A smart, brave girl who still dressed nicely and respected adults. Little Women was perfect. Lessons about sacrifice, family, and becoming proper ladies. But if you tried to read something too adventurous, too dark, or too rebellious, it would be taken away. Your imagination was encouraged, but only if it stayed within acceptable boundaries. Play wasn't freedom, it was practice. And the 1950s wanted to make sure you were practicing for the right role. Quiet, helpful, maternal, and completely unthreatening. Fun was fine, as long as it taught you how to serve. If you ran indoors, you'd be scolded. If you ran outdoors too fast, you'd be told to slow down before you hurt yourself or ruined your dress. Yelling was absolutely forbidden unless the house was on fire. And roughhousing, wrestling, tackling, pushing was for boys. Girls were delicate, fragile, and not built for chaos. Never mind that you had energy, opinions, and a pulse. You were expected to move through the world like a porcelain doll, pretty, still, and silent. And if you broke that rule, well, there were plenty of people ready to glue you back into place. Let's talk about running. You had energy. You were a child. Running was natural, instinctive, joyful. But in the 1950s, running was also dangerous, not because you'd hurt yourself, but because you'd look unladylike. If you ran indoors, you'd be yelled at immediately. No running in the house! You'll break something. And they didn't mean you'd break a lamp. They meant you'd break the image of femininity you were supposed to project. Outdoors wasn't much better. You could run, technically, but not too fast. Not with abandon. Not like you were free. If you sprinted across the yard, hair flying, dress flapping, arms pumping, someone would tell you to slow down. You're going to fall and hurt yourself. You're going to rip your dress. Young ladies don't run like wild animals. So you learn to move at half speed, always aware, always controlled. Yelling was even worse. If you raised your voice indoors, you'd be reprimanded instantly. Inside voices, please. We don't shout in this house. Even if you were excited, even if you'd just seen something amazing and wanted to share it, you were expected to control your volume, your enthusiasm, your entire presence. Outside, you had a bit more leeway, but not much. If you yelled while playing, you'd be told you were too loud, too disruptive, too much. Boys could scream and holler all day. You were supposed to be soft-spoken, even when you were having fun. Roughhousing was absolutely out of the question. No wrestling, no tackling, no play fighting. Those were boy activities, and girls who participated were tomboys. Again, not a compliment. If you tried to wrestle with your brother or roughhouse with friends, you'd be pulled aside and told that wasn't appropriate. You're going to hurt yourself, you're going to ruin your clothes. That's not how young ladies behave. The message was clear. Your body was fragile. You needed to be protected not from actual danger, but from anything that made you look strong, wild, or free. Because strong girls grew into strong women, and strong women were threatening, so you walked instead of ran. You spoke softly instead of yelling. You played gently instead of wrestling. You learned to shrink yourself, to minimize your presence, to move through the world like you were apologizing for existing. And if you ever forgot, if you let yourself run full speed, shout with joy, or tumble in the grass, someone would remind you, firmly, that young ladies don't act like that. Going to church, gloves. Going to the store, gloves. Going literally anywhere outside your house, gloves. For young girls in the 1950s, gloves weren't just an accessory, they were a requirement. White cotton gloves for every day, fancier ones for special occasions. They symbolized modesty, cleanliness, and respectability. Never mind that they were impractical, uncomfortable, and constantly getting dirty. You wore them anyway because not wearing them meant you were uncivilized. And heaven forbid anyone think your family didn't know how to dress a child properly. Let's start with the basics. You owned at least 2 pairs of gloves, everyday gloves and Sunday gloves. Everyday gloves were simple white cotton, wrist length, with no embellishments. They got dirty quickly, smudges from holding railings, stains from touching anything remotely grimy. But you wore them anyway, every time you left the house. If you forgot them, your mother would send you back inside to get them. No exceptions. Sunday gloves were fancier. Maybe they had a little lace trim or a delicate button at the wrist. These were reserved for church, formal events, and any occasion where you'd be seen by important people. You kept them clean, pristine, stored carefully in a drawer wrapped in tissue paper. If you got them dirty, you'd be scolded. These gloves represented your family's status, your mother's attention to detail, and your own ability to behave properly. Why gloves? Officially, they protected your hands. They kept you from touching dirty surfaces directly. They added an extra layer of modesty. Bare hands were somehow too intimate, too exposed. But really, gloves were a symbol. They said, this girl has been raised correctly. This family has standards. This child knows how to present herself in public. The problem? Gloves were wildly impractical. Try opening a door while wearing gloves. Try holding a coin purse. Try eating anything without getting crumbs trapped in the fabric. You couldn't feel anything properly. Not the texture of fabric in a store. Not the temperature of a railing. Not your mother's hand when she held yours. Everything was filtered through cotton, and they got dirty. Constantly. One trip to the grocery store and your pristine white gloves had smudges, fingerprints, and mysterious stains. You'd go home, and your mother would inspect them. If they were too dirty, you'd have to wash them, by hand, gently in cold water, then lay them flat to dry. If they were beyond saving, you'd get a lecture about being more careful. But the worst part, you couldn't take them off, even if your hands were sweating. Even if the gloves were itchy, even if you desperately wanted to feel the breeze on your skin, gloves stayed on in public, always. Removing them was inappropriate, immodest, and a sign that you lacked self-control, so you kept them on no matter how uncomfortable, no matter how ridiculous it seemed. And if you showed up somewhere without gloves, people noticed, they whispered, "Did you see her hands? Completely bare. What kind of mother lets her daughter go out like that?" Your family's reputation took a hit. You'd be mortified, and your mother would make sure you never forgot your gloves again. Gloves were just one more way the 1950s controlled girls' bodies, reminding them that even their hands were public property, subject to judgment, expectation, and endless, exhausting rules. Sunday mornings weren't for sleeping in. They were for church, and not just attending church, performing church. You wore your best dress, your shiniest shoes, your most uncomfortable hat. You sat still through the entire service. No squirming, no whispering, no passing notes. You sang the hymns even if you didn't know the words. You bowed your head during prayers. You didn't ask why the sermon was so boring or why God cared so much about your hemline. You just sat there, a miniature model of obedience, while adults nodded approvingly. And afterward, you shook hands, smiled politely and said, "Yes, Mom," until your face hurt. Let's start with getting ready. Sunday morning began early, earlier than school days, which felt deeply unfair. You had to bathe the night before because there wasn't time in the morning. Your mother laid out your church dress, freshly ironed, usually something in pastel with lace or ribbons. It was stiff, scratchy, and designed to make you look angelic rather than comfortable. You put on your best shoes, Mary Jane's polished until they gleamed, even though they pinched your toes. Then came the hat. Oh, the hat. Little girls wore hats to church, usually small bonnets or decorative caps secured with bobby pins that dug into your scalp. The hat matched the dress, matched the gloves, matched the whole coordinated outfit that took your mother hours to plan. Then there was your hair. It had to be perfect. Curled, pinned, ribboned, and sprayed into submission. If you had slept on pin curls the night before, your head ached from the metal clips, but at least your hair looked properly feminine. If you had bangs, they were brushed and pinned precisely. Any flyaways were smoothed down with water or pomade. You looked like a doll in a shop window, pristine, untouchable, and slightly miserable. The drive to church was tense. Your father drove carefully, your mother checked her lipstick in the mirror, and you sat in the back seat trying not to wrinkle your dress. If you fidgeted, you'd get the look, that silent parental glare that meant stop it right now or else. You arrived early because arriving late was humiliating. Everyone would turn and stare as you shuffled into a pew, and the gossip would start immediately. Can you believe they were late? What kind of example is that? Inside the church, you filed into your family's usual pew. Yes, families had assigned spots, claimed through years of habit and territorial Sunday morning wars. You sat between your parents or next to your siblings, hands folded in your lap, feet flat on the floor, posture perfect. The service began. You stood when told to stand. You sat when told to sit. You bowed your head during prayers, even though you couldn't see anything and didn't know when to lift it back up, so you just peeked at the adults and copied them. The hymns were another challenge. You were expected to sing, but not too loudly. You held the hymnal even if you couldn't read all the words. You followed along, mouthing lyrics, hoping no one noticed you were faking half of it. If the hymn had 4 verses, you sang all 4. No one cared that you were bored. Boredom wasn't an excuse. And then came the sermon. This was the hardest part. You had to sit completely still for 30, 40, sometimes 50 minutes, while the pastor talked about sin, salvation, duty, and obedience. His voice droned on and on. The pew was hard. Your dress itched. Your feet dangled above the floor and your legs started to fall asleep. But you couldn't move, couldn't shift, couldn't scratch. If you squirmed, your mother would place a firm hand on your knee, a silent warning. If you whispered to your sibling, your father would lean over and give you a look that could curdle milk. You tried to stay focused. You tried to listen. But the sermon was designed for adults, full of references you didn't understand and warnings about sins you didn't even know existed. So you stared at the stained glass windows, counted the tiles on the floor, traced patterns in the wood grain of the pew in front of you. Anything to pass the time. Finally, mercifully, the service ended. But you weren't done. After church came the social gauntlet. You filed out slowly, shaking hands with the pastor, smiling at the elderly ladies who pinched your cheek and told you how much you'd grown. You stood next to your parents while they chatted with other families, discussing the sermon, the weather, and who was hosting next week's potluck. You smiled. You nodded. You said yes, Mum, and no, sir, until your face ached. Church wasn't about faith. It was about performance. It was about showing the community that your family was respectable, devout, and properly raising their children. And you, whether you liked it or not, were the proof. parents, teachers, pastors, neighbours, all were authorities and all were above reproach. If they told you to do something, you did it. If they gave you advice, you accepted it. If they criticised you, you thanked them. Questioning why, pushing back or offering a different perspective was considered rebellion, and rebellion was unthinkable. Because girls who questioned authority grew into women who questioned society. And society in the 1950s had no use for women who asked too many questions. Let's be clear about what never contradict actually meant. It didn't just mean don't talk back rudely. It meant don't correct, don't clarify, don't offer a different viewpoint, and certainly don't question the logic behind what an adult was saying. Even if they were factually, objectively wrong. Even if you knew better. Even if staying silent meant letting a lie become truth. Imagine this. You're at school. Your teacher is explaining the solar system. She says something incorrect. Maybe she gets the order of the planets wrong, or misstates a fact you just learned from a library book. Your hand itches to raise itself. You want to help. You want to contribute. But you don't. Because correcting a teacher, even politely, even with evidence, is disrespectful. You'd be sent to the principal's office. Your parents would be called. You'd be labelled a troublemaker. So you sit there, silent, while incorrect information is taught to the entire class. Or you're at home. Your father is telling a story about his youth. He gets a date wrong, mixes up two events, or misremembers a detail. You know because you've heard the story before and it was different last time, but you say nothing. Because interrupting your father to correct him would be unforgivable. He's the head of the household. His word is final, even when it's wrong. Or you're at church. The pastor makes a statement about history, science, or current events that doesn't align with what you've read. But you don't question it. You don't ask for clarification. You don't even furrow your brow in confusion. You sit there, nodding along, because questioning a pastor is questioning God himself. Or at least that's what they'd have you believe. The rule extended to all adults, neighbours, relatives, family friends, shopkeepers, bus drivers, anyone over the age of 18. If an adult spoke to you, you listened. If they gave you instructions, you followed them. If they criticised your behaviour, your appearance, or your manners, you apologised and promised to do better. Even if their criticism was unfair, even if they were being cruel. Let's say a neighbour stops you on the street and says, "Your dress is too short." Young ladies should dress modestly. Never mind that your dress meets every standard your mother set. Never mind that this neighbour is just nosy and judgmental. You don't defend yourself. You say, "Yes, Mom, I'll be more careful." You smile. You go home humiliated. And if you complain to your mother, she might defend you privately, but would never confront the neighbour publicly. Because disagreeing with another adult, even in defence of your child, caused social friction. And social friction was to be avoided at all costs. Or maybe a teacher criticises you unfairly, accuses you of cheating when you didn't, blames you for something another student did, gives you a lower grade because she doesn't like your attitude. You can't fight back. You can't defend yourself. You can't appeal to logic or justice. You accept it. You take the punishment. Because challenging a teacher's authority, even when you're innocent, would make everything worse. The lesson was clear. Adults are always right. Even when they're wrong, they're right. Because the hierarchy matters more than the truth. Obedience matters more than accuracy. And your job as a child, especially as a girl, isn't to think critically or stand up for yourself. It's to submit. This rule didn't just silence your voice. It taught you that your perspective had no value, that your intelligence didn't matter, that truth was less important than maintaining the social order. And the message sank deep. Don't question. Don't challenge. Don't think too hard. Just smile, nod, and obey. Because girls who asked too many questions were problems, and problems didn't get married. By the time you hit double digits, You were expected to have a solid foundation in domestic skills. Sewing? You should be able to hem a skirt and sew on a button. Cooking? You should know how to make toast, scramble eggs and help with dinner. Cleaning? You were already vacuuming, dusting and scrubbing floors. These weren't hobbies, they were survival skills for your future as a housewife. And if you complained, you'd be reminded that someday your husband will thank us. As if your entire purpose in life was to make a man comfortable. Let's start with sewing. By age 10, you'd already spent years watching your mother mend clothes, hem skirts and patch holes. Now it was your turn. You sat at the kitchen table with a needle, thread and a scrap of fabric, learning to make small, even stitches. Your fingers were clumsy at first. You pricked yourself constantly. The thread tangled. The stitches were crooked. But you kept practicing because sewing wasn't optional. It was essential. You learned to sew on buttons, carefully threading the needle, anchoring the button, looping through each hole multiple times, knotting it securely. You learned to hem skirts and dresses, folding the fabric, pinning it, stitching it by hand or with your mother's sewing machine if you were old enough. You learned to darn socks, patch holes in pants, and repair torn seams. These skills weren't about creativity or self-expression. They were about maintenance, frugality, and making sure your future family's clothes stayed wearable. Cooking was even more intensive. By 10, you were expected to help prepare every meal. Breakfast meant cracking eggs, buttering toast, setting the table, and cleaning up afterward. Lunch was simpler: sandwiches, soup from a can, maybe leftovers reheated on the stove. But dinner was a production. You helped your mother peel vegetables, measure ingredients, stir pots, and set timers. You learned recipes by watching, by doing, by repeating them until they were automatic. You learned to make meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, pot roast, and Jell-O salad. Those very 1950s staples. You learned how to follow a recipe exactly. No improvising, no experimenting. Cooking wasn't about creativity. It was about consistency. Your future husband would expect the same meals his mother made, and you needed to be able to deliver them. Baking was part of the curriculum too. Cookies, cakes, pies, biscuits, all required precision. You measured flour carefully, levelled it with a knife. You learned the difference between baking soda and baking powder. You learned how to cream butter and sugar, fold in egg whites, and test a cake for doneness with a toothpick. If something turned out wrong, burnt, underbaked, too dense, you tried again. Because a woman who couldn't bake was a woman who couldn't host. And hosting was a crucial wifely duty. Cleaning was the foundation of it all. By 10, you'd already been cleaning for years, but now the expectations intensified. You didn't just dust, you dusted thoroughly, moving every knick-knack, wiping every surface, getting into corners and crevices. You didn't just vacuum, you vacuumed in straight lines, moved furniture, checked for missed spots. You didn't just wash dishes, you washed, rinsed, dried, and put everything away in its proper place. You learned to scrub floors on your hands and knees, to clean windows until they were streak-free, to polish silver until it gleamed. You learned to do laundry, sorting colours, treating stains, hanging clothes on the line, folding everything perfectly. You learned to make beds with hospital corners, to organise closets, to keep every room in the house ready for unexpected guests. And through it all you were reminded, this is for your future. Your husband will expect a clean home. Your children will need proper meals. This is what wives do. Your worth was being measured by your ability to serve. Your value was tied to how well you could maintain a household. And if you ever complained, if you said you were tired or bored or wanted to do something else, you'd be told you were ungrateful, lazy, destined to be a bad wife. These weren't skills you were learning for yourself. They were skills you were learning for someone else. And that message, delivered over and over from age 10, onward, shaped how you saw yourself, not as a person with potential, but as a future servant whose training had already begun. If you had a brother, you lived in two different worlds. He could climb trees, get dirty, talk back, and still be called spirited. You had to be quiet, clean, polite, and pleasant. He could play outside until dark. You had to be home by dinner. He could ask questions. You had to accept answers. The rules weren't fair, but fairness wasn't the point. The point was to prepare you for a life where men had freedom and women had expectations. And if you pointed out the double standard, well, that just proved you weren't ladylike enough yet. Let's break down the differences. Your brother woke up and threw on whatever clothes were clean or cleanish. No one cared if his shirt was wrinkled or his socks matched. You woke up and had to dress perfectly, hair brushed, shoes on, looking presentable for a day at home. He stumbled to breakfast in his pajamas sometimes. You never did. At breakfast, he could shovel food into his mouth, chew loudly, and leave crumbs everywhere. Someone would tell him to slow down, but it was gentle, amused. Boys will be boys. If you ate too fast or made a mess, you'd be corrected sharply. Young ladies eat properly. After breakfast, he ran outside to play, climbed trees, dug in the dirt, built forts, caught frogs, came home covered in mud and grass stains. And when he walked in the door looking like he'd been wrestling a bear, your mother would sigh and say, "Go wash up before dinner." That was it. No lecture, no punishment, just boys being boys. You, on the other hand, had to stay clean. If you wanted to play outside, fine, but don't get dirty. Don't rip your dress, don't mess up your hair, and be back inside in time to help with chores, which your brother never had to do. When you asked why he didn't have to set the table or fold laundry, you'd be told that's not his job. He has other responsibilities, like what? Taking out the trash once a week? Your brother could talk back, not disrespectfully, but he could question things. Why do I have to go to bed now? Why can't I have dessert? And sometimes your parents would actually explain. They'd negotiate. They'd meet him halfway. If you asked the same questions, you'd be shut down immediately. Because I said so. Don't question me. Young ladies don't argue. He could be loud. He could yell, roughhouse, wrestle with friends and make noise all day long. If he got into a fight at school, your father would ask if he won. If you raised your voice even once, you'd be sent to your room for being unladylike. He had freedom. He could ride his bike around the neighbourhood until the street lights came on. He could explore, wander, go to friends' houses without checking in every hour. You had a short leash. You had to stay where your mother could see you or know exactly where you were. You had to be home earlier. You had to ask permission for everything. And the justification? Boys need to be independent. Girls need to be protected. But protected from what? From freedom? From adventure? From having the same childhood he had? The double standard was everywhere. He could be messy. You had to be neat. He could be loud. You had to be quiet. He could be ambitious. You had to be modest. He could dream of being a pilot, a doctor, an astronaut. You were told to dream of being a wife. And if you ever pointed it out, if you ever said, "That's not fair," why does he get to do that and I don't? You'd be dismissed. Life isn't fair. Men and women have different roles. Stop comparing yourself to your brother, as if the problem was your attitude, not the system that treated you differently from birth. Your brother wasn't the enemy. He was just living in a different reality, a reality where his gender gave him freedom, second chances, and permission to be human. Meanwhile, you were learning that your gender came with restrictions, expectations, and a lifetime of apologizing for wanting the same things he got without asking. Pants were for boys, farmers, and rebels. If you were a respectable young girl in the 1950s, you wore dresses. Always. To school, to church, to play, to bed. Okay, maybe not to bed, but you get the idea. Even in winter, you wore dresses with tights or leggings underneath. Pants were considered unfeminine, inappropriate, and borderline scandalous. Never mind that dresses were impractical for climbing, running, or sitting comfortably. You wore them anyway because your body was supposed to signal your gender at all times, and skirts were the uniform of femininity. Let's talk about how impractical this was. You woke up, put on a dress, you went to school in a dress, you played at recess in a dress, you did chores in a dress, you climbed stairs, rode bikes, did cartwheels, all in a dress. And every single one of those activities became more difficult, more awkward, and more restrictive because of what you were wearing. Playing outside was a constant negotiation with fabric. If you wanted to hang upside down on the monkey bars, you had to hold your dress down with one hand. If you wanted to climb a tree, you had to be hyper-aware of how your dress was positioned. If you sat on the ground to play jacks or marbles, you had to arrange your skirt carefully around you, tucking it under your legs to preserve modesty. Meanwhile, boys just sat down. No thought, no adjustment, just gravity and comfort. Riding a bike in a dress was an Olympic sport. The skirt would blow up in the wind, exposing your legs or, heaven forbid, your underwear. So you learned to tuck it tightly under you, to hold it down with one hand while steering with the other, or to give up entirely and just walk your bike instead. Some girls pinned their skirts between their knees, others used clothespins to attach the fabric to itself, creating a makeshift barrier. All of this just to ride a bike. Winter made everything worse. You still wore dresses, but now you added layers underneath. Tights, leggings, sometimes even pants under your dress if it was cold enough and your mother allowed it. But the pants couldn't show. They had to be completely hidden. Because if anyone saw you wearing pants, even as an underlayer, you'd be judged. So you bundled up, waddling around like a fabric burrito, sweating indoors and freezing outdoors, all to maintain the appearance of femininity. And then there was the constant wardrobe maintenance. Dresses wrinkled, dresses stained, dresses tore. You were expected to keep them clean and neat, which was nearly impossible when you were a child doing child things. If you got dirt on your hem, you'd be scolded. If you ripped a seam, you'd have to sew it. If you outgrew a dress, your mother would hem it, let it out, or pass it down to a younger sibling. Nothing was disposable. Everything had to last. Meanwhile, your brother wore pants. Sturdy, practical, comfortable pants. He could run, jump, climb and tumble without worrying about his clothes flying up or getting in the way. He could sit however he wanted. He could move freely. And no one thought twice about it. The message was clear. Boys' bodies were allowed to move freely. Girls' bodies were not. Your clothing was designed to restrict you, to remind you constantly that you were different, that you needed to be careful, modest, controlled. Dresses weren't just fashion, they were a physical manifestation of the limitations placed on your gender. Some girls tried to rebel. They'd sneak pants, wear them at home, or change into them when their mothers weren't looking. But if they were caught, the punishment was swift. Pants were a rejection of femininity, a rejection of your role, a rejection of everything you were supposed to become. And that was unacceptable, so you wore dresses every day, in every season, for every activity. Not because you wanted to, but because you had no choice. Your wardrobe was decided by your gender, and your gender came with rules that prioritized appearance over comfort, modesty over movement, and femininity over freedom. Messy hair was unacceptable. Short hair was suspicious. Long tangled hair was a disgrace. Young girls were expected to have their hair brushed, styled and controlled at all times. Braids, ponytails, ribbons, barrettes, anything that kept hair out of your face and signalled that someone cared enough to groom you properly. If your hair was too wild, too short or too boyish, people whispered. Because in the 1950s, even your hair was a moral statement. And heaven help you if it didn't match the decade's definition of femininity. Let's start with the daily routine. Every morning, before you did anything else, you brushed your hair. Not a quick run-through, a thorough, painful brushing session that involved yanking out tangles, smoothing down flyaways, and creating a perfectly controlled hairstyle. If your mother was doing it, she wasn't gentle. "Beauty is pain," she'd say as she ripped the brush through a knot. "Hold still." The acceptable styles were limited and specific. For younger girls, braids were popular. Tight, neat braids secured with elastic bands and ribbons. French braids, pigtails, single braids down the back. Each one required time, skill, and patience. If your braids were loose or messy, you'd be told to redo them. If your part wasn't straight, same thing. Your hair was being judged, and by extension, so was your mother's parenting. Ponytails were another option, but they had to be smooth, no bumps, no loose strands. The hair tie had to match your outfit. A ribbon was even better, something coordinated tied in a bow, signalling that effort had been made. If your ponytail sagged by lunchtime, you'd be expected to fix it. Walking around with messy hair was unacceptable. For girls with longer hair, pin curls or rag curls were common. At night, your mother would roll sections of your hair around strips of fabric or metal pins, securing them tightly against your scalp. You'd sleep on them uncomfortably and wake up with curls in the morning. Then she'd brush them out, creating soft waves or ringlets. The whole process took hours and hurt like hell, but the result was feminine, polished, and socially approved. Short hair was a different story. If a girl had short hair, people assumed something was wrong. Maybe she'd been sick and her hair fell out. Maybe she'd gotten lice and it had to be cut. Or maybe, and this was the worst assumption, she was a tomboy who rejected femininity. Short hair on boys was normal, practical, expected. Short hair on girls was suspicious. It challenged gender norms. It made people uncomfortable. If your hair was naturally curly, frizzy, or difficult to manage, you were expected to control it, straighten it, pin it back, slick it down with water, pomade, or whatever products were available. Natural texture was seen as messy, unkempt, and unrefined. The goal was smoothness, sleekness, control. Your hair was supposed to look like you'd spent time on it, because you had. And then there were the accessories. Ribbons, barrettes, headbands, bows, all chosen to match your outfit, all positioned perfectly. If your bow slipped, you fixed it. If your barrette fell out, you put it back. These weren't just decorations, they were signals. They said, this girl is cared for, this girl is feminine, this family has standards. If you showed up to school with messy hair, teachers noticed. Other mothers noticed. You'd be pulled aside and asked if everything was okay at home. Because messy hair wasn't just a bad hair day, it was evidence of neglect. It meant your mother wasn't doing her job. It meant your family was struggling. It meant you were slipping through the cracks. The pressure was constant. Your hair had to be perfect, not for you, but for everyone watching. It had to signal obedience, femininity, and social respectability. And if it didn't, well, you'd face judgment, whispers, and the constant reminder that even your hair was being evaluated as proof of your worthiness. Periods, puberty, bras, growing pains, none of it was discussed openly. If you had questions, you were handed a vague pamphlet or told to ask your mother, who would then give you an even vaguer explanation involving flowers and birds. Your body was changing, but you weren't allowed to talk about it, understand it, or acknowledge it. Shame was baked into every biological milestone, and if you dared bring it up in public, you'd be hushed immediately. Because respectable girls didn't discuss such things, they just silently endured them. Let's start with puberty education, or the lack thereof. Most girls entered puberty with almost no information. No one sat you down and explained what was happening to your body. No one prepared you for the changes that were coming. Instead, you noticed things. Your body started to shift, soften, develop, and you had no idea if it was normal or terrifying. When you got your first period, it was often a complete shock. You saw blood and panicked. If you were lucky, your mother had left a vague pamphlet in your room, something from the school nurse or a company that made sanitary products. The pamphlet had cartoon diagrams and euphemistic language. Your body is preparing to become a woman. This is a special time in your life. But it didn't explain the pain, the mess, the fear, or the logistics. When you told your mother, she might have handed you a thick pad that attached to a belt. Yes, a belt, and told you to figure it out. Or she might have given you a 10-second explanation. This happens every month now. Don't talk about it. Keep yourself clean. It's private. That was it. No discussion of cramps, no advice on tracking your cycle, no reassurance that what you were feeling was normal. And you definitely couldn't talk about it with anyone else. Not your friends, not your teachers, not your siblings. If you mentioned your period at school, even in a whisper, to explain why you felt sick, you'd be mortified. Girls who talked openly about their periods were considered crude, immodest, and inappropriate. The goal was to hide it completely, to act like nothing was happening, to pretend your body wasn't betraying you every single month. Bra were another source of silent shame. When your chest started to develop, your mother might notice and take you shopping, quietly, without explanation. You'd stand in a dressing room while a saleswoman measured you, touched you, adjusted straps, and talked around you like you weren't there. No one explained what was happening or why. You were just handed bras and told to wear them. If you asked questions, you'd be shushed. You're growing up. That's all you need to know. And if you developed early, forget it. Older girls, boys, even adults would comment on your body. My, you're growing up fast. Someone's becoming a young woman. The attention was uncomfortable, invasive, and confusing. But you weren't allowed to express discomfort. You just smiled politely and tried to disappear. If you developed late, that came with its own shame. Other girls had bras. You didn't. Other girls had started their periods. You hadn't. You felt left behind, abnormal, broken. But you couldn't talk about it. Couldn't ask if you were okay. Couldn't seek reassurance. You just waited, worried, and hoped your body would catch up. Body hair was another taboo. If you noticed hair growing in new places, no one explained it. You were just handed a razor maybe, and expected to figure out the rest. Or you were told to ignore it, that it was improper to discuss. Shaving, plucking, bleaching. These were skills passed down silently, learned through observation and trial and error. The underlying message was clear. Your body is shameful. Its natural processes are embarrassing. You should hide them, manage them quietly, and never ever speak about them. This silence created fear, confusion, and shame around normal biological functions. It taught you that your body was something to be ashamed of, something dirty and secret. And that shame followed you into adulthood, colouring how you understood yourself, your health, and your worth. Gratitude wasn't optional, it was mandatory. You were supposed to be thankful for your food, your family, your education, your opportunities, even when those opportunities were severely limited by your gender. If you complained, you were ungrateful. If you questioned authority, you were disrespectful. If you wanted more, you were selfish. The message was clear. Accept what you're given, smile, and say thank you. Because girls who demanded better were troublemakers, and troublemakers didn't get married. Let's talk about what this looked like in practice. At dinner before you ate, you had to express gratitude. Sometimes it was a formal prayer. Thank you, Lord, for this food and for the hands that prepared it. Sometimes it was just an expectation. Eat quietly, don't complain, and appreciate that you have food at all. If the food was bad, overcooked, underseasoned, or just plain unappetizing, you ate it anyway, with a smile. Because millions of children were starving and you were lucky to have anything. If you received a gift, even one you didn't want or couldn't use, you had to act thrilled. Oh, thank you. I love it. Even if it was an itchy sweater, 2 sizes too small, or a doll you were too old for, you wrote a thank you note immediately, in perfect cursive, expressing your deep appreciation. Because not being grateful was rude, and rudeness reflected poorly on your upbringing. At school, you were expected to be grateful for your education. Never mind that the curriculum was limited, that girls weren't encouraged to pursue higher learning, or that you were being prepared for marriage, not careers. You were lucky to be in school at all. Girls in other countries weren't so fortunate, so you sat quietly, learned your lessons and thanked your teachers, even the ones who dismissed your intelligence or treated you like you were less capable than the boys. If your parents made sacrifices, working long hours, going without luxuries, stretching the budget, you were reminded of it constantly. We do so much for you. You don't know how good you have it. Children in my day didn't have half of what you have, and you were expected to respond with gratitude, not questions. Not, why don't we have more money? Or why do you work so hard? Just thank you. I appreciate it. But here's where it gets darker. You are also expected to be grateful for injustice, for limitations, for inequality. If you pointed out that boys had more freedom, more opportunities, more respect, you'd be shut down. You should be grateful for what you have. Girls in other places have it worse. If you asked why you couldn't pursue certain careers or dreams, you'd be told be thankful you have a roof over your head and food on the table. Stop asking for more. The message was insidious. Wanting more made you ungrateful. Questioning unfairness made you selfish. Demanding equality made you a troublemaker. And troublemakers weren't loved. They weren't valued. They weren't marriageable. So you learned to swallow your frustration. You learned to smile and say thank you even when you were being limited, controlled, and dismissed. You learned that gratitude was a weapon used against you, a way to silence your voice, dismiss your needs, and make you complicit in your own oppression. And the worst part, you started to believe it. You started to think that maybe you were ungrateful, that maybe you should be satisfied with less, that maybe wanting more was selfish, inappropriate, and wrong. You internalized the message that your role was to accept, to appreciate, and to never ever demand better. Exercise was fine if it was graceful, quiet, and didn't make you sweat. Ballet? Lovely. Jumping rope? Acceptable. But basketball, baseball, soccer, or anything competitive? Absolutely not. Sports were for boys. Girls who played them were called tomboys, and not in a cute way. If you showed athletic talent, you'd be gently discouraged and redirected towards something more feminine, like piano lessons or flower arranging. Because strength, competition, and victory were masculine traits. And you, dear girl, were supposed to be soft. Let's start with what was allowed. You could take ballet lessons, that was encouraged. Ballet taught grace, poise, and discipline. It made you move elegantly, control your body, and perform in pretty costumes. It was physical activity wrapped in femininity, and therefore acceptable. You could also do gymnastics to a point. Cartwheels and handstands were fine for young girls, but anything too athletic, too competitive, or too public was discouraged as you got older. Jumping rope was another approved activity. It was gentle, rhythmic, and you could do it in a dress without much trouble. You could play hopscotch, jacks, or other games that involved minimal movement and maximum control. These activities kept you active without making you look aggressive, sweaty, or unfeminine. But team sports? Forget it. If you wanted to play basketball, baseball, or soccer with the boys at recess, you'd be steered away. That's too rough for girls. You'll hurt yourself. Why don't you play something more appropriate? And by appropriate, they meant something that didn't challenge gender norms. Even if your school had girls' sports teams, which many didn't, they were treated as secondary, less important, barely funded. The boys' teams got uniforms, equipment and attention. The girls' teams got hand-me-downs and pity. If you were good at sports, really good, it didn't matter. There was no future in it. No scholarships, no professional leagues, no path forward. So why bother? If you showed athletic talent, adults would redirect you. You're very strong, but have you thought about cheerleading? Cheerleading was acceptable because it supported boys' sports. You could be athletic as long as you were cheering for someone else's victory, not pursuing your own. You could jump, flip and shout, but only in service of male athletes. That was feminine. That was supportive. That was your role. And if you pushed back, if you said you wanted to play basketball, not cheer for it, you'd be labelled a tomboy. And tomboy wasn't a compliment. It was a warning. It meant you were rejecting femininity. It meant you weren't developing properly. It meant you'd have trouble attracting a husband someday because men didn't like girls who were too strong, too competitive, too aggressive. The fear wasn't just that you'd get hurt. The fear was that you'd become unfeminine, that sports would make you muscular, sweaty and loud, that competition would make you aggressive and ambitious, that winning would make you confident and independent. And all of those traits were threatening, because strong, confident, independent girls grew into strong, confident, independent women. And the 1950s had no idea what to do with those, so you were redirected, pushed toward activities that made you softer, quieter, more controlled. Piano lessons instead of soccer practice, flower arranging instead of track and field. Anything that kept you indoors, kept you still, kept you feminine. And if you secretly loved sports, if you were fast, strong, coordinated, you hid it, you downplayed it, you pretended you weren't interested, because showing athletic ability was yet another way to fail at being a girl. Girls weren't allowed to be angry. Anger was loud, ugly, and unfeminine. If something upset you, you swallowed it. If someone hurt your feelings, you stayed quiet. If you were frustrated, you smiled through it. Crying was barely tolerated, and only if it was delicate, quiet, and quickly resolved. Anything more was hysterical. Boys could throw tantrums and be called passionate. But if you raised your voice, clenched your fists, or expressed any emotion stronger than mild disappointment, you'd be labelled difficult, dramatic, or worse, uncontrollable. Let's start with what happened when you got angry. Maybe your brother broke your toy. Maybe a friend betrayed you. Maybe a teacher treated you unfairly. You felt the anger rise, hot, sharp, justified, but you couldn't express it. If you yelled, you'd be sent to your room. If you cried angry tears, you'd be told to calm down. If you clenched your fists or stomped your foot, you'd be labelled hysterical. Hysterical was the go-to word for any girl who showed strong emotion. It literally comes from the Greek word for uterus, the implication being that women's emotions were caused by their reproductive organs, not by, actual problems. If you were upset, it wasn't because something was wrong. It was because you were female, emotional and irrational. Your feelings were dismissed before you even explained them. Boys, on the other hand, could be angry. They could yell, throw things, get into fights, and adults would say, "He's just passionate. He's got spirit. Boys will be boys." Their anger was seen as strength, as drive, as leadership potential. Your anger was seen as a character flaw, so you learned to suppress it. When something made you angry, you smiled. You took a deep breath. You swallowed the words that wanted to burst out. You went to your room, closed the door, and maybe cried quietly into your pillow. But you never let anyone see. Because showing anger made you difficult. And difficult girls didn't get invited to parties, didn't make friends easily, and definitely didn't get married. Frustration was treated the same way. If you were struggling with homework and felt frustrated, you couldn't express it. If you were tired from doing chores all day, you couldn't complain. If you were overwhelmed by the endless expectations placed on you, you couldn't say so. You just kept going, kept smiling, kept pretending everything was fine. Crying was slightly more acceptable, but only if you did it right. Delicate tears quietly shed, quickly wiped away. Crying that made you look vulnerable and feminine was okay, but sobbing, wailing, crying so hard you couldn't catch your breath, that was hysterical. That was too much. You'd be told to get control of yourself, to stop being so dramatic, to calm down before you made yourself sick. And if you cried out of anger, not sadness, forget it. Angry crying was the worst offence. It meant you'd lost control completely. It meant you were irrational, emotional, and unstable. You'd be dismissed entirely. You're too upset to think clearly. We'll talk when you've calmed down. Which was code for, your feelings don't matter until you can express them calmly, politely, and without inconveniencing anyone. This emotional suppression had consequences. You learned that your anger wasn't valid, that your frustration was an overreaction, that your feelings were too big, too much, too wrong. You learned to distrust your own emotions, to question whether you had a right to be upset, to apologize for feeling anything at all. And you carried that into adulthood. You became a woman who couldn't express anger without feeling guilty, who apologized for being frustrated, who cried in bathrooms because crying in public was too embarrassing, who smiled through injustice because showing anger would make you look difficult, unstable, or hysterical. The 1950s didn't just control your body and your behavior, it controlled your emotions, and that control lasted a lifetime. No one asked you what you wanted to be when you grew up. The answer was already written, wife and mother. Maybe you'd work as a secretary, teacher, or nurse until you got married, but that was just killing time. Your real job was to find a husband, have children, and maintain a home. Dreams of becoming a doctor, lawyer, scientist, or business owner. Cute, but unrealistic. And if you said them out loud, you'd be gently corrected, because girls who aimed too high ended up disappointed. Better to accept your role and be happy with it. Let's talk about how this message was delivered. It started early. When adults asked little boys what they wanted to be, the answers were endless. Astronaut, president, scientist, cowboy, baseball player, inventor. And adults would smile and say, maybe you will be, encouraging them to dream big. When they asked you the same question, you might say doctor, pilot, or explorer, and they'd laugh. Not meanly, but dismissively. That's sweet, honey, but girls can't really do those jobs. What you'll really be is a mommy. Doesn't that sound nice? At school, the tracking began. Boys were encouraged to take advanced math and science. They were groomed for college, for careers, for ambition. You were steered toward home economics, typing and secretarial skills. Not because you weren't smart. Sometimes you were smarter than the boys. But because your intelligence was seen as a tool for supporting a husband, not building your own career. If you excelled academically, you'd get praise, but with a caveat. You're so smart. You'll be able to help your children with their homework someday. Your intelligence was valuable only in service to others. If you said you wanted to go to college to become a scientist, teachers would gently redirect you. That's a difficult path for a woman. Have you thought about teaching or nursing? Those are wonderful careers for women, and you can stop when you have children. And there it was, the assumption that you'd stop, that your career, if you even had one, would be temporary, a placeholder until your real life began. Marriage and motherhood. No one planned for you to have both. No one asked if you wanted both. The assumption was that once you married, your job was done. You'd quit working, move to the suburbs, and dedicate yourself full-time to being a wife. Your mother reinforced this. She taught you to cook, clean, and sew, not as hobbies, but as your future job description. Someday you'll have your own kitchen, she'd say. Someday you'll be taking care of your own family. Someday was code for inevitably. There was no if, only when. And if you dared to question it, if you said, "But what if I don't want to get married?" Or "What if I want a career?" you'd be met with concern, not support. Every girl wants to get married. You'll change your mind when you meet the right man. You don't want to end up alone, do you? Being unmarried wasn't presented as a choice. It was presented as a failure, a tragedy, a life half-lived. The marriage timeline was specific. You'd graduate high school, maybe attend a year or two of college not to get a degree, but to meet a suitable husband. You'd get engaged by 21, married by 23, and start having children immediately. That was the plan, the only plan, and if you deviated from it, people worried. She's 25 and still single. What's wrong with her? Even the careers deemed acceptable for women had limits. If you became a teacher, you'd be encouraged to teach elementary school, nurturing children, an extension of motherhood. If you became a nurse, you'd be caring for others, again in a maternal role. If you became a secretary, you'd be supporting a man in his career. Notice the pattern? Every acceptable job for women involves serving, supporting, or nurturing, never leading, never competing, never pursuing your own ambition. And here's the cruelest part. You started to believe it. You started to think that maybe your dreams were silly, that maybe marriage and motherhood really were the only things that mattered, that maybe wanting more was selfish. You learned to dream smaller, to want less, to accept the path that had been laid out for you before you were even born, because fighting it meant being labelled difficult, unhappy, or unwomanly, and in the 1950s, those labels destroyed you. If you were under 12, makeup was forbidden. If you were a teenager, it was allowed, but only barely. A little powder, maybe some lipstick, but nothing too dramatic. Bright colours, heavy eyeliner, or anything that made you look fast was out of the question. Your clothes were monitored just as closely. Hemlines, necklines, sleeve length, all carefully regulated by mothers, teachers, and church ladies with rulers. You weren't dressing for yourself. You were dressing to signal respectability. And one wrong outfit could ruin your reputation. Let's start with makeup. Before you turned 12 or 13, makeup was completely off limits. If you snuck your mother's lipstick and got caught, you'd be in serious trouble. You look like a clown. You're too young for that. Wash your face right now. Makeup was for grown women, and you weren't one yet. Even playing with makeup, putting it on just for fun at home was discouraged. It sent the wrong message. It made you look like you were trying to attract attention. And attention, especially male attention, was dangerous. Once you hit your teens, makeup became acceptable, but heavily regulated. The goal was to look natural, fresh-faced, and wholesome. A little powder to reduce shine. A touch of blush for colour. Maybe some mascara if you were careful. Lipstick in soft pinks or corals. Never red. Red lipstick was for actresses, pin-up girls, and loose women. If you wore red lipstick to school, you'd be sent to the principal's office and told to remove it immediately. Eyeliner was suspicious. If you lined your eyes heavily, especially in dark colours, you'd be accused of trying to look older, more provocative, more adult. The implication was clear. You were trying to attract boys, and trying to attract boys meant you were morally questionable. Good girls didn't need makeup to get attention. They were naturally beautiful, naturally modest, and naturally pure. If you experimented with makeup, tried a bold colour, a dramatic look, something creative, you'd be shut down. You look like a streetwalker. What will people think? Go upstairs and wash that off. Your face wasn't yours to decorate. It was public property, and the public demanded that you look innocent, clean, and unthreatening. Fashion was even more controlled. Every aspect of your clothing was monitored. Hemlines, necklines, sleeve length, tightness, colour, pattern. If your skirt was too short, teachers measured it. Literally. With rulers. You'd kneel on the floor and they'd measure the distance from your knee to your hem. If it was more than an inch above the knee, you'd be sent home to change, or you'd be given a detention, or you'd be forced to wear an oversized gym shirt over your clothes for the rest of the day, publicly shamed for your immodesty. Necklines were scrutinized just as closely. Too low, and you'd be told you were being provocative. Too revealing, and you were asking for trouble. Boys can't concentrate when girls dress like that. As if your clothing choices were responsible for boys' inability to focus. As if your body existing was a distraction that you needed to manage. Sleeves had to be a certain length. No spaghetti straps. No tank tops. Nothing sleeveless unless it was summer, and even then you'd get side-eye. Shoulders were considered too sensual to expose. Bare arms were too tempting. Your body was a minefield of potential sin, and every inch of exposed skin was a moral failing. Tight clothing was forbidden. Even if it fit you properly, if it showed your figure too clearly, you'd be criticized. That's too form-fitting. You can see every curve. You need to wear something looser. The goal was to hide your body, to obscure your shape, to pretend you didn't have developing breasts, hips, or any physical maturity at all. Because acknowledging your body meant acknowledging sexuality. And sexuality was terrifying. Colours mattered too. Pastels were safe: pink, blue, yellow, lavender. Bright colours were attention-seeking. Dark colours were sophisticated but suspicious. Red was dangerous. Black was too mature. You were supposed to dress like a child even as you stopped being one, signalling innocence and purity at all times. And here's the thing. None of this was actually about protecting you. It was about controlling you. Your appearance was constantly policed because your appearance was seen as a reflection of your character. If you dressed modestly, you were a good girl. If you didn't, you were asking for trouble. The responsibility for how others perceived you, judged you, or even harassed you was placed entirely on your shoulders. If something bad happened, the first question would be, what were you wearing? So you dressed carefully. You checked yourself in the mirror constantly. You asked your mother if your outfit was appropriate. You lived in fear of being called out, shamed, or labelled. And you learned that your body was something to hide, something to be ashamed of, something that could ruin you if you didn't manage it correctly. Parents, teachers, pastors, neighbours, all were authorities, and all were above reproach. If they told you to do something, you did it. If they gave you advice, you accepted it. If they criticised you, you thanked them. Questioning why, pushing back, or offering a different perspective was considered rebellion. And rebellion was unthinkable. Because girls who questioned authority grew into women who questioned society. And society in the 1950s had no use for women who asked too many questions. Let's talk about what absolute obedience actually looked like. It meant that when your father told you to do something, you didn't ask why. You didn't negotiate. You didn't offer an alternative. You said, "Yes, sir," and you did it immediately. Even if his request didn't make sense, even if you were in the middle of something else, even if it felt unfair, his word was law, and law wasn't up for debate. Your mother's authority was just as absolute, though expressed differently. She controlled the domestic sphere, and within that sphere her rules were non-negotiable. If she told you to redo a chore, you did it without complaint. If she criticised how you folded laundry or washed dishes, you accepted the criticism and did better next time. You didn't defend yourself. You didn't point out that you'd done it correctly. You just nodded and tried again. Teachers held immense power. If a teacher gave you a bad grade, you accepted it. If a teacher punished you unfairly, you took the punishment. If a teacher humiliated you in front of the class, you sat there and endured it. You didn't complain to your parents because they'd side with the teacher. The teacher must have had a reason. You must have done something to deserve it. Don't question your teacher. They know what's best. Even if you witnessed a teacher making a mistake, teaching incorrect information, punishing the wrong student, losing their temper inappropriately, you stayed silent. Reporting it would make you a tattletale. Questioning it would make you disrespectful. The hierarchy was more important than the truth. Adults were always right, even when they were obviously demonstrably wrong. Pastors and religious authorities were untouchable. If a pastor said something during a sermon that confused you or contradicted what you'd learned elsewhere, you didn't question it. You didn't ask for clarification. You assumed you'd misunderstood. Because questioning a man of God was questioning God himself. If a Sunday school teacher taught something that didn't make sense, you accepted it on faith, literally. Even neighbours and family friends had authority over you. If a neighbour saw you doing something they disapproved of, running too loudly, wearing something too casual, sitting in a way they found improper, they could correct you. And you had to accept that correction graciously. Thank you for letting me. No, Mum. Then you go home, and your mother would hear about it, and you'd be punished again for embarrassing the family. The message was consistent and unrelenting. Adults know best. Your thoughts, your feelings, your observations, none of them matter. You are a child, and children don't have the wisdom, experience, or right to question their elders. Your job is to listen, obey, and learn. And if you learn anything, it should be that obedience is the highest virtue. This absolute deference to authority had dark consequences. It meant you couldn't recognize abuse when it happened. If an adult hurt you, physically, emotionally, or otherwise, you assumed you deserved it. If an authority figure made you uncomfortable, you blamed yourself for being too sensitive. You were taught that adults were always right, and always had your best interest at heart. So when one didn't, you had no framework for understanding it, no language to describe it, and no permission to speak up about it. It also killed your critical thinking. You learned not to analyze, not to evaluate, not to question. You learned to accept what you were told without examination. You learned that curiosity was dangerous and skepticism was disrespectful. You learned to be passive, compliant, and intellectually dependent on others. Because independent thinkers were threats, and girls who grew into independent thinking women were problems the 1950s didn't want to deal with. Your reputation was fragile, precious, and almost impossible to repair once damaged. One rumour, one mistake, one moment of poor judgment, and you could be labelled for life. Fast, wild, improper. These words followed girls like shadows, and once you were labelled, there was no coming back. So you lived carefully, cautiously, constantly aware that someone was always watching, always judging, always ready to whisper. Because in the 1950s, a girl's reputation wasn't just hers, it was her family's, her future, and her only currency. Let's be clear about what reputation meant. It wasn't about your character, your kindness, or your intelligence. It was about appearance. Specifically, the appearance of sexual purity and moral righteousness. Your reputation was determined by what people thought you did, not what you actually did. And perception was everything. If you were seen talking to a boy for too long, people whispered. If you laughed too loudly at a party, people noticed. If you wore your skirt a little too short, people made assumptions. It didn't matter if you were actually doing anything wrong. What mattered was whether it looked wrong. And in a world where everyone was watching, everything looked suspicious. The worst label you could receive was fast. Fast meant promiscuous, loose, morally questionable, and you didn't have to actually do anything sexual to be called fast. You just had to look like you might. Maybe you wore red lipstick, maybe you went to a party unchaperoned, maybe you dated multiple boys, not at the same time, just one after another. Maybe you were just pretty, confident and friendly. Any of those things could get you labelled, and once you were labelled fast, that was it. Your reputation was destroyed. Boys would still pursue you, but not for marriage. They'd assume you were available for things good girls didn't do. Other girls would distance themselves from you, afraid your reputation would contaminate theirs. Mothers would warn their sons to stay away from you. You'd become a cautionary tale, whispered about at church potlucks and PTA meetings. There was no appeal process, no way to prove your innocence, no court where you could defend yourself. The court of public opinion has decided, and its verdict was final. You could try to rebuild your reputation by being extra modest, extra quiet, extra obedient. But people had long memories, and forgiveness was rare. Even small mistakes could be catastrophic. If you were caught holding hands with a boy before you were officially dating, rumours spread. If you stayed out past curfew, people assumed the worst. If you wore shorts in public, you were called improper. If you went swimming and your bathing suit was too revealing, church ladies would discuss it for weeks. Every action was analysed. Every choice was scrutinised. Every mistake was magnified. And the cruelest part, boys didn't face the same consequences. A boy could date multiple girls, stay out late, get caught kissing someone, and he'd be called a ladies' man. It was a compliment. It meant he was charming, desirable, masculine. But if you did the same things, you were ruined. The double standard was breathtaking. Boys had reputations for being fun, adventurous, or popular. Girls had reputations for being good or bad. That was it. 2 categories. And falling into the wrong one meant social death. Your reputation wasn't just about you, it was about your entire family. If you were labelled, your mother would be blamed for raising you poorly. Your father would be seen as too permissive. Your siblings would be tainted by association. That's the family with the wild daughter. Your family's social standing, their friendships, their place in the community, all of it could be damaged by your actions. So the pressure wasn't just personal, it was familial. You weren't just protecting yourself, you were protecting everyone who shared your name. So you lived carefully. You monitored every interaction, every outfit, every word. You avoided situations that could be misinterpreted. You stayed home when you wanted to go out. You turned down invitations that seemed risky. You never, ever gave anyone a reason to talk. Because in the 1950s, your reputation was all you had, and losing it meant losing everything. By the time you were a teenager, every lesson, every rule, every expectation had been building toward one goal: preparing you to be a perfect wife. Cooking, cleaning, sewing, hosting, smiling, supporting, sacrificing, these were your future. You weren't training for a career, you were training for a role, and that role demanded perfection. Because in the 1950s, a woman's worth was measured by how well she served her family, and you, whether you liked it or not, were being moulded to fit that mould. Let's talk about what this training looked like. By age 13 or 14, you were essentially running a household alongside your mother. You cooked entire meals from scratch. You cleaned the house top to bottom. You did laundry, mended clothes, and managed household supplies. You weren't just helping, you were apprenticing. Learning the skills that would define your adult life. Cooking became increasingly complex. You moved beyond scrambled eggs and toast. Now you were making pot roasts, casseroles, pies, and elaborate jello salads. You learned to plan meals for a week, to shop on a budget, to stretch leftovers into new dishes. You learnt the importance of timing, getting everything to the table hot, at the same time looking perfect. You learnt to cook what men liked: meat, potatoes, gravy, nothing too exotic or spicy. Your future husband would have preferences, and you needed to be ready to accommodate them. Cleaning standards intensified. It wasn't enough to clean, you had to clean to someone else's standards. Your mother's, your future mother-in-law's, your hypothetical husband's. Floors had to shine, windows had to be streak-free, bathrooms had to sparkle, dust was unacceptable, clutter was a moral failing. You learned to deep clean, to organise, to maintain a home that looked like it belonged in a magazine, because your home would be a reflection of you. And if your home was messy, people would assume you were lazy, incompetent, or morally deficient. Hosting was another crucial skill. You learned to set a proper table, to make conversation with guests, to serve food gracefully. You learned to smile even when you were exhausted, to make everyone feel welcome, to be the perfect hostess. Your future would involve dinner parties, church gatherings, neighbourhood coffee mornings. You needed to be able to entertain your husband's colleagues, impress his boss's wife, and never let anyone see you sweat. You also learned emotional labour, though no one called it that. You learned to manage everyone's feelings, to smooth over conflicts, to keep the peace. If your father was in a bad mood, you stayed out of his way. If your mother was stressed, you helped without being asked. If your siblings were fighting, you mediated. You learned that your job was to make everyone else comfortable, even at the expense of your own comfort. You learned to sacrifice. Your needs came last, after your father's, your brother's, even your younger siblings. If there wasn't enough food, you took a smaller portion. If there wasn't enough money for new clothes, you made do. If you were tired but someone needed help, you helped. Sacrifice wasn't noble, it was expected. Women sacrificed. That's what they did. And underneath all of this was one constant message. Your future husband's happiness depends on your skills. If you're a good cook, he'll be satisfied. If you're a good housekeeper, he'll be proud. If you're a good hostess, he'll be respected. Your entire identity was being constructed around serving someone you hadn't even met yet. Someone whose needs, preferences, and expectations would determine the rest of your life. You weren't encouraged to think about what you wanted, what kind of life you'd enjoy, what would make you happy. Those questions weren't relevant. Your happiness would come from making others happy. Your fulfillment would come from fulfilling your role. And if you ever felt unfulfilled, unsatisfied, or trapped, well, that meant you weren't trying hard enough. The training was relentless. Every day brought new lessons in domestic perfection, and the stakes were high. Because if you failed, if you turned out to be a bad cook, a messy housekeeper, an awkward hostess, you'd struggle to find a husband. And without a husband, what were you? Nothing. No one. A failure. So you learned. You practiced. You perfected. And you buried any dreams that didn't fit inside the narrow box labelled wife. If your family could afford it, you were sent to etiquette classes, formal lessons in how to walk, talk, sit, eat and exist properly. You learned how to hold a teacup, how to greet guests, how to write thank you notes in perfect cursive. You practiced introductions, handshakes and polite small talk. You were taught which fork to use, how to fold a napkin, and how to exit a room gracefully. These weren't hobbies, they were requirements. Because a girl who didn't know etiquette was an embarrassment. An embarrassment reflected poorly on everyone. Let's talk about what actually happened in these classes. You'd arrive dressed in your nicest clothes, a proper dress, gloves, polished shoes. You'd sit in a room with other girls your age, all of you nervous, all of you trying to look confident. The instructor, usually an older woman with impeccable posture and a stern expression, would begin with the basics. Walking. You'd think walking was natural, instinctive. But no, there was a correct way to walk, and you needed to learn it. You practiced walking across the room with books balanced on your head. If the book fell, you started over. The goal was to glide smoothly, head up, shoulders back, steps, measured and graceful. No bouncing, no swaying, no looking at your feet. You were training your body to move with controlled elegance, like a dancer or a show horse. Sitting was another lesson. You didn't just plop down into a chair. You approached it from the side, smoothed your skirt beneath you as you sat, crossed your ankles, never your knees, and kept your back straight without touching the chair back. Slouching was forbidden. Leaning was lazy. You sat like you were posing for a portrait, still, composed, perfect. Then came table manners, the most complex and anxiety-inducing part of etiquette training. You learned which utensils to use for which courses, the salad fork versus the dinner fork, the soup spoon versus the dessert spoon. You learned to cut your food with your knife in your right hand and fork in your left, then switch them to eat, or was it the other way around? European style versus American style. The rules were confusing, arbitrary, and absolutely crucial. Using the wrong fork could brand you as uncultured. You practiced eating soup, scooping away from yourself, sipping silently from the side of the spoon, never slurping. You practiced cutting meat into small bites, chewing quietly with your mouth closed, dabbing your lips with your napkin between bites. You practiced drinking from a glass without leaving lipstick marks. Everything was choreographed, practiced, perfected. Conversation was another skill set. You learned to make polite small talk without ever saying anything too controversial, too personal, or too interesting. Weather was safe, compliments were encouraged, questions about someone's family were acceptable, but politics, religion, money, or anything that might cause disagreement, off limits. You were supposed to be pleasant, agreeable, and utterly non-threatening. You learned how to introduce people properly. Mrs. Johnson, may I present my friend, Miss Anderson? Miss Anderson, this is Mrs. Johnson. Older people were introduced to younger people. Women were introduced to men. The hierarchy was specific, and getting it wrong was mortifying. Thank you notes were drilled into you. You learned to write them in perfect cursive on proper stationery within 24 hours of receiving a gift or attending an event. The format was specific: greeting, expression of gratitude, specific mention of the gift or event, closing sentiment, signature. No abbreviations, no casual language, no smudges or cross-outs. If you made a mistake, you started over on fresh paper. You also learned how to enter and exit a room gracefully, how to shake hands firmly but not too firmly, brief but not too brief, how to make eye contact without staring, how to smile warmly without looking too eager, how to hold a conversation while standing at a cocktail party, how to excuse yourself politely from a boring conversation without offending anyone. All of this was designed to turn you into a socially acceptable woman, someone who could move through upper middle class society without embarrassing herself or her family, someone who knew the unspoken rules and could perform them flawlessly. Because in the 1950s, how you behaved was who you were, and if you didn't know the rules, you were nobody. If a boy teased you, hit you, or pulled your hair, adults would smile and say, "Boys will be boys." It meant he liked you. It meant he was being playful. It meant you should accept it. But if you fought back, yelled, or defended yourself, you were the problem. You were unladylike. You were overreacting. The rules were clear. Boys got to be wild, messy, and aggressive. You had to be calm, controlled, and forgiving. And if that seemed unfair, well, life wasn't fair. Get used to it. Let's start with the most common scenario. A boy bothering you at school. Maybe he pulled your pigtails. Maybe he pushed you on the playground. Maybe he called you names or took your pencil. You told a teacher hoping for justice. And what did the teacher say? Oh, he just likes you. That's how boys show affection, as if physical aggression was romantic, as if hurting you was a compliment. You were supposed to smile, to blush, to accept this attention as proof that you were desirable. Never mind that it hurt. Never mind that you didn't want it. Never mind that you'd explicitly told him to stop. His behavior was excused, explained away, even encouraged. Because boys expressing themselves, even violent, was natural, and you resisting it was unfair to him. If you fought back, if you hit him back or shoved him, you'd be punished. Swiftly. Young ladies don't hit. What were you thinking? He barely touched you and you attacked him. The boy might get a mild talking to. You get detention. A phone call home and a lecture about self-control, because girls hitting boys was scandalous. But boys hitting girls? That was just boys being boys. The phrase boys will be boys was a universal shield. It excused everything. Boys being loud, boys will be boys. Boys breaking things, boys will be boys. Boys bullying, fighting, destroying property, hurting others, boys will be boys. It wasn't a description, it was an excuse. It meant boys weren't expected to control themselves. They weren't held to the same standards. They got a free pass for behaviour that would have gotten you expelled. Meanwhile, you were held to impossible standards. You had to be gentle, kind, forgiving and understanding. If a boy was mean to you, you were supposed to consider his feelings. Maybe he's having a hard day. Maybe he doesn't know how to express his emotions. Maybe you should be more patient with him. His bad behaviour became your responsibility to manage, and it got darker. If a boy touched you inappropriately, grabbed you, cornered you, made you uncomfortable, adults often responded the same way. He probably didn't mean it. He's just being friendly. Don't make a big deal out of it. You were taught to downplay your own discomfort, to excuse his behaviour, to blame yourself for being too sensitive. Because boys exploring boundaries was natural, and you setting boundaries was uptight. You learned that your feelings didn't matter as much as his intentions, or rather, what adults assumed his intentions were. You learned that boys got second chances, third chances, infinite chances, while you were expected to be perfect from the start. You learned that the world made excuses for boys and expected girls to quietly absorb the consequences. This extended beyond school. If your brother broke something, he'd get a light punishment. If you broke something, you'd be lectured about being more careful. If he talked back to your parents, they'd sigh but let it go. If you did the same, you'd be sent to your room. If he made a mess, someone would clean it up. If you made a mess, you'd clean it plus everyone else's. The double standard was suffocating. You watched boys get away with everything while you were punished for minor infractions. You watched boys praised for being spirited while you were criticised for being difficult. You watched boys take up space, make noise, demand attention, and receive it, while you were told to be smaller, quieter, less. And when you pointed it out, when you said, "That's not fair," you were dismissed. Life isn't fair. Boys and girls are different. Stop comparing yourself to him. As if the problem was your perception, not the system that treated you differently from birth. You learned that equality wasn't the goal. Compliance was, and boys didn't have to comply. Only you did. You were expected to do well in school, but not too well. Good grades were fine, but being the smartest in the class made boys uncomfortable, and making boys uncomfortable was a cardinal sin. So you learned to downplay your intelligence, hide your ambitions, and let boys take the lead. After all, you didn't need to be brilliant. You just needed to be pleasant, helpful, and pretty enough to attract a husband. Education was a backup plan, not a goal, and girls who forgot that were labelled too smart for their own good. Let's talk about what this looked like in the classroom. You were a good student. You studied hard. You understood the material. You raised your hand when you knew the answer. And then one day, a teacher, or a parent, or a guidance counsellor pulled you aside. "You're very smart," they said, "but you need to be careful. Boys don't like girls who are too smart. You don't want to intimidate them." Wait, what? Your intelligence, your hard work, your academic achievement, all of it was suddenly a problem. Not because you weren't doing well, but because you were doing too well. Because your success might make boys feel bad about themselves, and their feelings were more important than your education, so you learned to hide it. If you knew the answer in class, you hesitated before raising your hand. You waited to see if a boy would answer first. If no one did, then maybe you'd raise your hand, tentatively, apologetically, and when you answered correctly, you'd downplay it. "Oh, I just got lucky." It was an easy question. Never. Yes, I know this because I studied. In group projects, you learn to let boys take credit for your ideas. You do the research, write the report, create the presentation, and then let a boy present it. Because boys were natural leaders, and you were a natural supporter. If you tried to take the lead, you'd be called bossy. If a boy did the same thing, he was showing initiative. You were also steered away from certain subjects. Math and science were for boys. If you excelled in these areas, you'd be quietly discouraged. Are you sure you want to take advanced math? It's very difficult. Maybe you'd prefer home economics. English and history were more appropriate for girls, less threatening, less competitive, less likely to lead to careers that competed with men. And college, that was complicated. If you wanted to go to college, you'd be supported to a point. But the expectation was that you go to find a husband, not to get an education. You'd major in something feminine, English, education, nursing, something that wouldn't intimidate potential suitors, and you'd drop out when you got married, or finish your degree and then never use it. If you expressed serious career ambitions, if you said you wanted to be a doctor, a lawyer, a scientist, you'd be gently redirected. That's a lot of schooling. Don't you want to have a family? Those are very demanding careers. How would you balance that with being a wife? The implication was clear. You could have a career or a family, but not both. And if you chose career, you'd be seen as selfish, cold, unfeminine. Your intelligence was valued only as a tool to support others. You'd use it to help your children with homework, to manage a household budget, to have intelligent conversations with your husband's colleagues at dinner parties, but not so intelligent that you showed them up. Your brain was an accessory, not an asset. And if you were too smart, if you graduated top of your class, won academic awards, got into a prestigious college, congratulations, and also, good luck finding a husband. Because smart women were intimidating. They were difficult. They had opinions, they asked questions, they challenged men. And men didn't want to be challenged. They wanted to be admired, supported and obeyed. So you learned to dumb yourself down, to laugh at jokes that weren't funny, to ask for help with things you could easily do yourself, to make boys feel smart by pretending to be confused. It was a performance and you got good at it. So good that sometimes you forgot you were pretending. Sometimes you started to believe that maybe you really weren't that smart. Maybe your ambitions really were unrealistic. Maybe you really should just focus on finding a husband. Education in the 1950s wasn't about unlocking your potential. It was about making you just educated enough to be interesting, but not so educated that you'd be threatening. And that narrow window was suffocating. If you were scared, no one cared. If you were tired, push through. If you were sad, smile anyway. Your feelings were inconvenient, irrational, and unimportant. You were supposed to prioritize everyone else's comfort, needs, and emotions above your own. And if you ever dared to say, I don't want to, or I don't like this, you'd be told you were being selfish. Because girls in the 1950s weren't people with inner lives, they were supporting characters in someone else's story, and supporting characters don't get to have feelings. Let's start with fear. Maybe you were afraid of the dark, of dogs, of heights, of speaking in front of people. Normal childhood fears. But when you expressed them, you'd be dismissed. Don't be silly. There's nothing to be scared of. You're being dramatic. Your fear wasn't acknowledged as real or valid. It was treated as a character flaw, something to be corrected, not comforted. If you cried out of fear, you'd be scolded. Stop that crying right now. What are you, a baby? Brave girls don't cry. So you learn to swallow your fear, to pretend you were fine, to push through even when you were terrified. Because expressing fear made you weak. And weakness was unacceptable. Sadness was treated the same way. If you were sad, maybe a friend hurt your feelings, maybe your pet died, maybe you just felt overwhelmed, you were expected to hide it. Put on a happy face. Don't be such a sourpuss. No one likes a sad girl. Your sadness was an inconvenience to others. It brought down the mood, it made people uncomfortable, so you smiled through it. If you said you were tired, you'd be told everyone was tired. I'm tired too, but I still have work to do. You're young, you have plenty of energy. Stop complaining and finish your chores. Your exhaustion didn't matter. The work still needed to be done, and you were expected to do it regardless of how you felt. And if you ever said, I don't want to go to this event, I don't want to wear this dress, I don't want to talk to this person, I don't want to do this chore, you'd be shut down immediately. I don't care what you want, you're doing it anyway. Your wants don't matter. This is about what's right. Stop being selfish and think about others for once. The message was clear. Your feelings are irrelevant. What matters is your behavior, your compliance, your ability to make others comfortable. You learned that expressing your feelings was wrong, that having strong feelings was wrong, that you yourself might be wrong for feeling anything other than cheerful gratitude. You learned to perform emotions you didn't feel, to smile when you were sad, to act excited when you were anxious, to pretend to agree when you disagreed. Your face became a mask and you wore it constantly, because letting people see how you really felt was dangerous. It gave them ammunition. It proved you were difficult, emotional, too sensitive. Meanwhile, other people's feelings, especially men's and boys' feelings, were prioritized. If your father was in a bad mood, everyone tiptoed around him. If your brother was upset, you were expected to cheer him up. If a boy's feelings were hurt, you were expected to apologize, even if he'd hurt you first. Their emotions were valid, important, worthy of accommodation. Yours were not. This emotional suppression didn't just hurt you in childhood, it followed you into adulthood. You became a woman who couldn't identify her own feelings, let alone express them, who apologized for being upset, who felt guilty for having needs, who prioritized everyone else's emotional well-being over her own, who believed deep down that her feelings really didn't matter, that she didn't matter, that her only value was in service to others. In the 1950s, big dreams were for boys. Girls who wanted too much were setting themselves up for disappointment. So you learned to dream small. A nice husband, a clean house, healthy children, a neighborhood that respected you. That was enough. That was everything. And if you secretly wanted more, to travel, to create, to lead, to explore, you kept it to yourself. Because girls who dreamed too big were called unrealistic, ungrateful, or worse. And in a world designed to keep you small, dreaming was the most dangerous thing you could do. Let's talk about what happened when you did dream big. Maybe you were 8 years old reading a book about scientists and you thought, I want to discover something important. Maybe you watched a movie about adventure and thought, I want to see the world. Maybe you heard about a woman doctor and thought, I want to help people like that. These were normal childhood dreams, ambitious, yes, but normal. And then someone crushed them. Gently perhaps, but crushed them nonetheless. That's a nice dream, honey, but it's not realistic for girls. Women don't really do those jobs. You'll understand when you're older. Your dreams were dismissed as fantasies, as childish impossibilities, as things you'd grow out of once you understood your place. So you learned to dream smaller. Maybe instead of being a doctor, you could be a nurse. Instead of being a scientist, you could marry one. Instead of traveling the world, you could read about it in books. Instead of leading, you could support someone who led. Your dreams were slowly, systematically shrunk to fit inside the box labelled appropriate for women. And eventually you stopped dreaming altogether. Or rather, you learned to dream the approved dreams. You dreamed about your wedding day, about the dress, the flowers, the moment he slipped the ring on your finger. You dreamed about your future home, about decorating it, hosting dinner parties, keeping it spotless. You dreamed about children, about their names, their personalities, the kind of mother you'd be. These weren't bad dreams. Marriage, home, family, there's nothing wrong with wanting those things. The problem was that they were the only things you were allowed to want. Everything else was off limits, unrealistic, unfeminine. Your dreams were supposed to revolve entirely around serving others. Your happiness was supposed to come from making others happy. Your success was supposed to be measured by your husband's success, your children's achievements, your home's appearance. And if you ever admitted to wanting more, if you said, "I want to do something important with my life," you'd be told, "What's more important than being a wife and mother?" As if wanting a career meant rejecting family, as if having ambitions meant you couldn't also have children, as if dreaming beyond domesticity meant you were ungrateful for the life you'd been given. The saddest part? You started to believe it. You started to think your dreams really were unrealistic, that you really were asking for too much, that maybe you should be happy with what was offered. You learned to kill your own dreams before anyone else could, to tell yourself no before the world did, to stay small because being small was safe. And here's what the 1950s didn't tell you. Those dreams didn't disappear. They went underground. They haunted you. They whispered to you late at night when everyone else was asleep. They reminded you of what you'd given up, what you'd been denied, what you could have been if only the world had been different. Some women carried those buried dreams their entire lives. They watched their daughters and thought, "I hope she gets to do what I couldn't." They looked back with regret, with longing, with the quiet ache of knowing they'd been capable of so much more. But by then it was too late. The choices had been made, the life had been lived, the dreams had been abandoned. Because in the 1950s, dreaming big as a girl wasn't just discouraged, it was dangerous. It threatened the entire system that depended on your smallness, your compliance, your willingness to serve. And so you were taught over and over in 1,000 different ways, don't dream, don't want, don't reach, just accept, just smile, just be grateful for the narrow life you've been given. Because girls who dreamed of more were problems, and problems got punished. So there you have it, a single day really, an entire childhood, as a young girl in 1950s America. Before you'd even hit your teenage years, you'd already been trained, moulded and restricted in ways that would shape the rest of your life. You woke up making beds with hospital corners. You dressed in uncomfortable clothes designed to restrict your movement. You sat silently while adults talked. You smiled when you wanted to scream. You learned to cook, clean and sew for a husband you hadn't met yet. You swallowed your anger, hid your intelligence and apologized for taking up space. You lived under constant surveillance, knowing that one wrong move could destroy your reputation forever. And you learned, over and over, that your dreams didn't matter, that your feelings were inconvenient, that your entire purpose was to serve, support, and sacrifice. These rules weren't accidents. They weren't well-meaning mistakes. They were deliberate. They were designed to turn little girls into compliant women. Women who wouldn't question authority. Women who'd accept inequality as natural. Women who'd raise the next generation to do the same. The 1950s didn't just have rules for girls, it had a system that controlled your body, your voice, your emotions, and your future. And it started before you were even old enough to understand what was happening to you. But here's what's remarkable. Despite all of this, despite the crushing weight of expectation and limitation, girls survived. They grew into women who found ways to carve out joy, meaning, and connection within the narrow spaces they were given. They supported each other. They whispered rebellions. They dreamed in secret. They passed down quiet acts of resistance to their daughters. They endured, and eventually, slowly, painfully, they began to push back. The women's liberation movement of the 60s and 70s didn't come from nowhere. It came from generations of girls who'd been told to sit still, be quiet, and accept less. Girls who grew into women who finally said, enough. Tonight, as you lie in your comfortable bed, maybe take a moment to think about those girls, the ones who wore gloves to the grocery store, the ones who couldn't wear pants, the ones who were told their intelligence was threatening and their dreams were unrealistic, the ones who were trained from birth to be wives before they ever got to be children. They didn't have the freedoms you have. They didn't have the choices. They didn't even have the language to describe what was being done to them and maybe whisper a quiet thank you. Thank you to the girls who survived these rules. Thank you to the women who eventually broke them. Thank you to everyone who fought so that future generations wouldn't have to make their beds perfectly before breakfast, wouldn't have to hide their intelligence to attract a husband, wouldn't have to dream small just to fit inside someone else's expectations. Because history isn't just about what happened, it's about what we learned. And what we learned from the 1950s is this: rules designed to keep people small eventually break. Dreams that are buried don't die. They grow stronger underground. And girls who are told they can't, who are taught they shouldn't, who are trained to serve and never lead, they grow up, and some of them change the world. So tonight, rest easy, dream big, take up space, be loud, be angry, be ambitious, be everything those 1950s girls were told they couldn't be. Not because their lives were wasted, but because their struggles made yours possible. Sleep well, and tomorrow, when you wake up, you won't have to make your bed with hospital corners. You can just live.